So, like I said, thank you everyone so much for joining us this evening. My name is Lauren Fender. I'm the coordinator of Reference and Public Services at the Belmont Public Library. And we are very excited to have Robin Yuan joining us this evening in collaboration with the Maynard Public Library, Wayland Free Library, and Winchester Public Library on Robin's first work of fiction, if I'm not mistaken, and not his first work in general, though, known as Red Bishop, which I have a copy here, and there's also the copy on the screen that you can see. And I'll tell you a little bit about Robin, though I'm sure he's going to share more about himself and sort of his background as well. He's a plastic surgeon practicing in Beverly Hills, California, graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Medical School. He enjoys tennis, golf, charity work, violins, and the company of his 2 children. As I mentioned, he is the author of 3 previous books: Cheer Up, You're Only Half Dead, Reflections at Midlife, Behind the Mask, Beneath the Glitter, The Deeper Truths About Safe, Smart Cosmetic Surgery, and The Skinny on Marriage, A Plastic Surgeon's Practical Guide. And as I just mentioned, also Red Bishop is his first novel, and it is dedicated to his family. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Robin.
Thank you, Lauren. I'm so glad to be here. I want to thank my sister, Fran, who actually helped set this up. And she's been a real champion for me in this book. Can you all hear me? Is the volume okay? Anyways, I wanted to present the genesis of my book and some salient features and characters within the book and some of the themes. I didn't want this to be too much of an academic lecture because, China and Christianity can be pretty heavy subjects in and of itself. And that was one of the challenges of writing this, is trying to make this a very readable and accessible book and not to be a academic tome on the history of China. So anyways, this is my the cover of my book, Red Bishop. I'll say a little bit more about the cover later on. This is my publishing company. I set this up to do self-publishing because I had experience with traditional publishers in the past, and the evolution of the business has been that self-publishing is much more acceptable and you have more control. And I want to thank Lauren for setting this up with the other libraries. As Lauren mentioned, this is my 4th book. It's I refer to it as a historical fiction. It's sort of what people may call faction, a lot of facts, true events, but fictionalized and dramatized. So these are my other books. This is a concept of my cover, which sort of mirrors what I was thinking in terms of writing the story, with my grandfather in the middle, my mother at the lower right, 3 maps of 3 countries, United States, China, and England, a cross in the middle because this is a book about religion, Christianity, the church, and at the top right, a Japanese warplane because there were many conflicts, not only with the Japanese, but with many nations and within China itself that marked the history of the 20th century China. So, and initially I set out writing what I referred to as the world's most challenging movie, because I felt that there was a story in there that might be well represented in movies, which I thought was more accessible to American audience than books. My motivation, I knew a bit about my grandfather. He goes by many different Romanized names. I realized as I was actually traveling through my own life that he was actually a historical figure. And, a story about my own family wouldn't be that interesting to some extent, but having him as a central figure, as a historical personality, I think is key to this whole story. I also felt that China was the most interesting and important country, and that a lot of people don't know its history. There was also a lack of Western movies, not Western in terms of cowboys and Indians, but for the Western audience. And yet there's a plethora of Holocaust movie. Every year there are, a dozen movies about the Nazi Germany and the Jewish Holocaust and World War II, but very few movies for the Western audience dealing with China and its history. There is also a misperception about Christianity in China. And even now, when I tell people that I've written this book about the church in China, they say, well, there's no religion in China. There's no Christians. What are you talking about? So I wanted to sort of shed some light on that. There's also numerous parallels and themes that occurred within this story that is still relevant today, even more so with the concerns with immigration, refugees, the war in Ukraine especially, and it brings back all the events in China's history that is still present today in different countries. The conflict within the United States among political parties mirrors that between the nationalists and the communists in China. And yet there's a paucity of meaningful cinematic dramas. Yet within this story, I felt that there was this idea of the tragedy, not only with my grandfather and the Chinese people, but also with my mother, and how that ended up being a very hopeful and positive ending, I suppose. You have to read the book to understand why that is. And then I had this personal connection to my grandfather. His chosen name when he was converted to Christianity was Jian Zhen, which means see truth or seek truth. And he gave me, grandfathers usually give the grandchildren their Chinese name. So he gave me the name Zhu Wang, which means hope of the ancestors. So I felt all my life sort of personally responsible to carry out his vision, I guess. So this is one of the first articles or excerpts from a book by Philip Wickery. He's the historian for the Hong Kong Anglican Church. And at the top, you can see that he was referring to Robin Chen, who was my mother's father. So my maternal grandfather, he was at this time the presiding bishop of the Anglican Church. And then at the bottom, you'll see that in 1918, T.S. Singh, Shen Daishen, son of the first Chinese Anglican cleric, was consecrated assistant bishop. And he was the first Chinese bishop, the first native bishop within the Anglican Church. And Bishop Singh happened to be my father's grandfather. And my father had always talked about Bishop Singh. So here we have my family essentially represented with two bishops. And just quickly, this is my father's grandfather's family. So the grandfather is in the back with the Chinese cap and the Chinese gown. This was just after he became assistant bishop. And my father is the little boy on the lower right, leaning against one of his sisters. He was one of 9 children. And this is my father with my grandfather as my paternal great-grandfather, stained glass window, which was housed in London. So just very quickly, my father, because this story is really also about me. I was always wondering, how I ended up in Newton, first Quincy and then Newton, having this sort of background that I vaguely knew about. This is my father. He's in the middle in the first row. He was the president of his St. John's Medical School class. And here's my mother. She was the president of her college class in Jingling. So they both came from very top-notch missionary colleges, both offsprings of bishops. And this is my mother's University of Pennsylvania Medical School class, and she's at the very bottom on the right. And I don't think you'll ever see an American medical school class like this ever again. So she was one of 3 women that started out and the only women who actually graduated, the only Chinese. So she was in some ways a pioneer. And this is my father, equally somewhat of a pioneer with his resident class in neurosurgery. And both of them have passed away. So unfortunately, they never got to see the final product of my efforts. But their story and my story started out way back in the early 1800s with Robert Morrison, who was the first Protestant missionary from Scotland. He was Scottish Anglo missionary, and he was sent to China in the early 1800s, and he spent about 27 years there. His claim to fame was translating the Bible into Chinese. And in his 27 years, he only converted or baptized 10 Chinese. So not very good batting average. And this is sort of what was happening at the time, the Opium Crisis. You know, we have the opioid crisis in the United States. This was the Opium Crisis in China. And very few people might know that although Britain was the #1 importer of opium, the United States was the second largest importer of opium. And trading companies right here in Boston were instrumental in that. And they, instead of having opium from India, they imported it from Turkey. So during the early 1800s, this opium trade proliferated throughout China, mainly from the south in Guangdong, and basically took over the Chinese society. Politically, the Westerners dominated the Chinese and forced them to accept the opium. And out of this came the Opium Wars. There are actually 2 Opium Wars. And the end result of these Opium Wars was obviously opium was allowed to be sold or imported, but also that there were settlements, international settlements in major Chinese cities. So these international settlements were controlled by Western countries. And they had their own legal system, their own police force, and a lot of trade that came through these ports. Along with the trade came missionaries. So the missionaries were sort of linked to this Western business. Oftentimes, the missionary who spoke Chinese very well were acted as translators. So this sort of conflation of Western business with and dominance with missionaries and the Christian religion turned the Chinese against the Christians in many different sort of rebellions. And so the Christians became persecuted during the 1800s. There were many uprisings that culminated in the Boxer Rebellion. So the Boxer Rebellion, the Chinese government lost, as you all might know from the 55 days at Peking with Charleston Heston. And the end result was that the missionaries were allowed, more freedom to sort of evangelize, and the Chinese government had to pay 8 countries money in reparations for all the damage they did to Western businesses and infrastructure. So the end result of that was more missionaries. And they did good things as well. They built schools, which my grandfather, as well as his wife and my great-grandfather, they all went to mission schools. And this is where the story began. This is the Wuhu St. James Mission School, the high school in Wuhu, China. And they also built clinics, medical clinics, hospitals. This is the Wuhu General Hospital built by Methodists. So the missionaries were looked on skeptically, were linked to this imperialism, yet they did a lot of good things for the social structure of Chinese. Here's the St. James Hospital. And in 1912, this is the synod or the gathering of the Protestant ministers and bishops. So you can see there's a smattering of Chinese ministers. You can see my grandfather in the back next to the window, in front of the window with the round face. And then in the front, that's my great-grandfather, my father's grandfather. And then in the front row are all the bishops. And as you can see, all the bishops at this time were Westerners, either from the United States, England, Canada, and Australia. And during this time is when Sun Yat-sen had his revolution and established the Republic of China with these three principles that were based from American politics, especially Abraham Lincoln. And he essentially ended the imperialist dynasty of China, which had reigned for thousands of years. So this revolution, okay, so this is where the story began for the Red Bishop. And I wrote the screenplay based on some of the research I did, because my concept was I just wanted to get the story out there, write a screenplay, have some director, producer pick it up and make this epic film like Lawrence of Arabia or Dr. Zhivago, all the things the movies that I grew up in with, which were so impactful, you know, cast of thousands. And that's what I saw, this big screen movie. So I wrote the screenplay. As you know, that you write some direction, you write some dialogue, and then you expect the directors, the actors, the costume design, and the musicians, everyone sort of work together to make this film. So I wanted other people essentially to do the work. During this time, right after I wrote the screenplay, I went to China, and here I visited the Three South Movement offices, spoke to executives there about, you know, how they would view trying to make this movie. And they had talked about this red line, as well as people that I talked to in the film industry. They said there's a red line you can't cross. It has to do with religion. You'll never get it made. You'll never be able to show it. The religious leaders told me, yes, there is a red line, but the red line is always moving. And you can sort of see that in today's China, where the government is always sort of manipulating, you know, what is permissible and not, depending on, you know, what will serve their purposes. So I still had some hope at that time that a movie might be able to be, you know, cross over this or push the red line. And I also visited the Holy Trinity Cathedral, which was this sort of house church, the home base for the Anglican Church in Shanghai, where my grandfather had preached when he was presiding bishop. It's a beautiful church. These pictures don't do it justice. Fairly simplistic, but in some ways just very beautiful ornamentation on the floor, the ceiling, the arches. So the challenges are many. I won't go through them with too much detail, but, you know, there's obviously a censorship issue. There's in America preoccupation with blockbuster entertainment, not so much with sort of intellectual cinematic dramas. The religious themes is problematic for the Communist Party. And there have been recent government crackdowns on religion and Christians and other religious groups like the Uyghurs, the Muslims in the north of China. The government had started to get more control of foreign investments over the last few years. There was a push to actually buy a lot of American companies, you know, production companies 4 or 5 years ago, and essentially all of them went away, and many of them went bankrupt. So the story is obviously Chinese-centric in that the protagonist, which would be my grandfather, he's Chinese, and that's not something that you can easily sell to American or Western audience. And Hollywood's focus is on getting movies made within China. And so if you can't show a movie in China because of the censorship, they're not really interested. So these were all the challenges, all these controversial issues you'll see. I talked about this germ warfare that the United States was accused of committing. That's very controversial. What happened in the Cultural Revolution? The Chinese government doesn't want anyone to sort of revisit that. And especially there's no gunfights, car chases, or sex scenes in this movie. So there's this big challenge for me to have my dream of having this movie made from this story. And I showed the script to many people, friends of mine in Hollywood, agents, producers, head of studios, and they didn't know what to do with it because of all the reasons I enumerated. But they all said, almost everyone to a T, said, you have to write a book. Go write a book. A book will help you. You need to write a book. And I said, I don't want to write a book. You know, I'm not a novelist. I'm not a biographer. I'm not a historian. It's too much work. I was sort of, you know, done with the story. But then I realized, okay, I need to write a book. So I did more research. So this is when the really hard work of putting this book together came about. Instead of just having sort of gross outlines and suggestions of, you know, actions and scenes that I hope a director would sort of interpret, I had to write every single word to elicit this story. So I did a lot of research. You can see memoirs, but especially by my mother and my aunt. Other people who were involved in my grandfather's life, they wrote memoirs, newspaper stories. Every time my grandfather went someplace in the United States, there was maybe a little article, and I would read the article and garner some fact or some sentiment from those articles. Books, manuscripts, and even PhD dissertations on various subjects that came into play. And every time I started to do some research, there was some other issue that came out, some other theme, some other character, and I'd have to do some research. I also used my mother's letters that she had saved from that were written by her family, predominantly her mother and her father. And I mentioned this in the book and how important those letters were to her, and how the handwriting was very different. My grandfather's handwriting was very tight, you know, very sort of frenetic, dense, and my mother's was more sort of floral and open and feminine. You know, that's something I noted when I went through this. So I had some of the key letters translated. I didn't translate them all because there were over 400. It would take me so much time and tremendous amount of money to get someone to translate all this, but I translated some of the key ones from different time intervals. They started in 1948, and I basically went through the ones up to 1966, which was the start of the Cultural Revolution. So I also had the advantage of my mother's notes that she took. She would transcribe articles from various periodicals and would type this out on the old-fashioned typewriter, would proofread them. It took a tremendous amount of work. There were hundreds of pages of these. And each of them would note some little event. These aren't her words, but these were reported by, oftentimes from church periodicals, were telling the story about what was happening in the church. And most of these were during the time of the Japanese occupation. And she also handwrote some memoirs and some recollections. And as you can see, her handwriting wasn't easy to read because obviously she's a doctor. So I had to go through that. And as I mentioned, there were newspaper stories. Here's one from 1930. When my grandfather, the Red Bishop, he's on the first sitting row, second from the left. He went to United States to study and get his sociology degree. And as I said, there were these articles, interviews that he did. And this was during the time of the Great Yangtze Flood in 1931, which I mentioned in the book. So he was in America at the time. His family was back in China. And he spent about 2.5 years during the 1930s. He also went back in the 1940, 46, 47, after the World War II, to garner support to rebuild the church. And as I say, every place he went to many different states, from the West Coast to the East Coast, from Canada down to Texas and Florida. And every time he ended up in a city, there would be little articles. So I was able to access these articles and piece together his thought. So this is sort of the concept of how the story evolved. So it started with me, obviously, thinking about, you know, how did I become a Harvard student and Newton, coming from this very different family background. So obviously I had to understand my parents' story, which I told you a little bit about. but predominantly the key figure was Bishop Chen, my mother's father, and his family, and what was happening, because they lived during this very interesting time in China during the new Republic of China, up until or after the Cultural Revolution into modern day. His life spanned that interval, and I said, well, you know, if you follow his life, you'll get to know a lot about the history of China, and that perspective, I think, is very important nowadays. So along with learning about his life and his family, I obviously had to understand a bit about the church, the Anglican Church, and along with the church, because it was intimately involved and influenced by what was going on within China itself, I had to get to know China's history and how it interacted not only within its borders, but also outside of it with the Western world. So this is a multi-layer, multi-dimensional story, and I found it very difficult to write, but I did write it. And so this is the first chapter, which I call The Word. And the scene is my grandfather right in the middle of the Cultural Revolution. He's driven in a wooden cart pulled by a bicycle by his daughter-in-law, his son, my Uncle Paul's wife. She rides his bikes and pulls him and my grandmother to a hospital because he's had over a decade worth of abdominal problems brought about by cirrhosis. And so this is one of the times that when the Red Guards are wreaking havoc, that he is driven to the hospital in Shanghai. And he sort of understands that he's dying and maybe this is the last time to go to the hospital. And he pulls close to my grandmother and whispers one word to her. Obviously, I don't know if this happened, but this sort of sets the stage for his whole story and what this word means and what his life means. And you have to read the book to know what that word is. So I tried to write it in sort of like a thriller where there's a cliffhanger to get you to read the next chapter and drive you to the end of the book, because, you know, reading about religion and China history can be very, very dry. So the Red Bishop, where that title come from, there's actually three meanings, one of which is Red Bishop, the chess character. This is Chinese chess. It's called Xiang. Xiang is the elephant. So the elephant is the black Xiang, or in the place of where the bishop is in our Western chessboard. You can see at the top of the page. And then the other Xiang, different, you know, sort of same sound, but different character, is the Red Bishop or Red Minister. And they both of them travel in diagonally like the regular bishop, but they travel two spaces or two intersections. The chess piece is played on intersections. So in the middle, so you can see in the middle, there is a blank space, and this blank space is the river. And the bishops and the elephants travel in this diamond shape, but they can't cross the river. They are defensive pieces. So in my head, I thought this was a great sort of metaphor for his life and being protective of China. It's a defensive piece, and he doesn't cross the river. He stays within his country. Whereas in Western chess, bishops go all over the place, and they're, you know, they're attack pieces. So the very different sort of concepts, which I thought played well into the dynamics of Western versus Chinese culture and ideas. So that's the Red Bishop, one of the Red Bishop. Here's his family. He got married in a sort of Christian wedding, top left, to Constance, who was also Christian. She was going to a girls' mission school. And this is his family. He's not in these pictures because in the middle, he was in United States getting his sociology degree. And on the right, this is them in 1946, just before my mother came to University of Pennsylvania. And he was again in the United States trying to drum up support for the church after World War II. This is my mother and my father. And so the story begins. That's sort of background of sort of the broad strokes the landscape. But the story begins with around 1912, when Sun Yat-sen takes over the imperialist China, helped by this warlord Yuan Shikai, who essentially brokered a deal where the last emperor of China gave up the throne to the power of the republic. And in exchange for that, Yuan Shikai became the president, and Sun Yat-sen was in exile. So Yuan Shikai was very clever, and he had a lot of power as a general, as a warlord general. This is Bishop Huntington, who was the bishop at the time in the diocese that my grandfather grew up in. Very instrumental in bringing Chinese ministers into the Anglican Church. This is Reverend or Mr. Lacey, who was a Swedish missionary, and he was the headmaster at the St. James Mission School. Alice Gregg was became sort of the educational head of the Anglican Church during the time that my grandfather became a minister, and just before he became a bishop. So she helped him sort of run the diocese. And another person in the story is Dr. Harry Taylor, who's called China Taylor. He was well known to being sort of brash and sort of very outspoken. And he was a very good friend of my grandfather. He was one of the last Westerners to leave Shanghai or to leave China through Shanghai once the communists took over. So the whole idea of the church after the republic began was this idea of three self-propagation, self-support, self-governing, because the Western bishops understood that without appealing to the native sentiments and having the church run by natives, they would probably not get very far. So there was this push to consecrate a lot of Chinese ministers and eventually turn the church over to them by making many of them bishops. During this time, this is in 1920, my grandfather had become a minister. He was serving in Wuhu. And this character, Mao Zedong, began the Communist Party, and Chiang Kai-shek was rising in power. So the 1920s was a period where the warlords reigned, and Chiang Kai-shek Sun Yat-sen, and then Chiang Kai-shek was in control of the Kuomintang Party, the nationalists, and Chiang was trying to put down the warlords. So China was in sort of a mess. It really didn't have very much government. It was run by these different warlords, and the people weren't being taken care of, and that's why Mao Zedong started the Communist Party, and it started to slowly gain power. And this culminated after the Japanese took over, both in the late 1920s and in 1937 with the Nanking Massacre. And so during this time, the nationalists and the communists were at odds with each other. They were fighting each other. The Japanese were taking over the country, essentially. They swept through Shanghai and Wuhu and Nanjing, very brutal, just like, maybe the Russians are in Ukraine. And they were heading towards Anqing, where my grandfather was stationed. The picture on the left is a story about two Japanese commanders who were competing with each other to see who could cut off the 100 Chinese heads the fastest. So you can see the scoreboard is 106 to 105, because after they reached 100, it was so competitive, they decided to continue it to a higher number. So very brutal. And that was in 1947. And this in 1940, my grandfather became assistant bishop. And this is his consecration with Bishop Craighill, who became the bishop of the Anqing diocese, which is in this Anhui Jiangxi province along the Yangtze River. And so this was their consecration during the time that the Japanese were occupying Wuhu. So I wanted to show where this takes place. So these are some of the cities which are mentioned in the book. You can see that most of them are in the southern part of China. The Yangtze River runs sort of right through the middle of China. But the interesting thing was, here's a map of the Japanese occupation. You see in 1940, it was mainly up north. They were trying to secure natural resources. But by 1940, at the end of the war, they had cut through all the way to Indochina or Vietnam. And it's basically isolated China. And you see that movement was right through where my grandfather had and his family lived, and they had to move around many times as refugees trying to escape the Japanese. So that story is told in a number of chapters. And it's sort of, I was just thinking, this sort of looks like Ukraine, where Russia is trying to isolate the country and control the seaboard and the Black Sea in Ukraine. Here's my mother with President Nero. She became fairly well known in China. She was the valedictorian of her college and was chosen as a representative of Chinese students to attend this Chinese Indian student meeting that commemorated the independence of India from Britain. So that's 1946, I believe. Another person mentioned in the book is Wu Yifang, who was the president of Jingling, who helped my mother gain entrance to the United States University of Pennsylvania. Geoffrey Fisher was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he's mentioned because my grandfather attended the what they call the Lambeth Conference in London in 1948, and that was very important because during that conference, the Chinese bishops who were 50-50 Chinese and Westerners had put forth a proposition to allow women to become full-fledged ministers. And that was shot down. The Chinese, especially the Westerners, the Western bishops, knew the importance of women long before that was true in the Western world. But they were shot down, and it signaled to me that the Chinese church had to be independent of their mother church. During so 1949 is when Shanghai became liberated, a lot of chaos, people leaving, and executions in the street where Kuomintang and nationalists and the local police would summarily execute communist sympathizers without any trial. Sometimes there were sort of dummy trials, but a lot of times they would just shoot these communist sympathizers. And then Mao, once Shanghai was occupied, declared the creation of the People's Republic of China, October 1949. So you see a lot of things were happening during these 3 decades. And then after 1949, this would be a crucial time for the church. And Y.T. Wu was the secretary of the YMCA, which was a very powerful and influential group in China. And he collaborated with Zhou Enlai to produce this Christian manifesto, essentially declaring allegiance to the Communist Party. YY2 was a bishop from Kunming along the Burmese Road, and he was part of the delegation that went to Lambeth. But after that, he didn't go back to China, and I think went to Canada, and eventually signed a declaration at the World Church Council condemning the Korean War. So a lot of things were happening at this time. During this Korean War incident, I want to go back and mention this. So what happened was my grandfather was asked by Y.T. Wu to sign this Christian manifesto to declare allegiance to the Communist Party and condemn American imperialism, all these sort of pro-communist things. And he refused to do that. He didn't refuse once, he didn't refuse twice, he refused 3 times, and then was called to Beijing to talk to Zhou, after which he was convinced that, okay, he should sign. And that was a very seminal moment because he was at this time the presiding bishop. The original, the bishop that preceded him, Bishop Chen, also Chinese, had had a stroke in the United States and he resigned. So my grandfather became presiding bishop. And obviously the Communist Party, the leaders, wanted him as the leader of the church to sign this Christian manifesto. And he didn't do that because he didn't know what the Communist Party was up to, didn't know if they would allow religious freedom, didn't want to condemn Americans because he was American bred to some extent, American schools, American buildings, American hospitals. He was very much influenced by America and very sort of pro-American. But this is also during this time, the Korean War started, and there was a story that the United States had committed germ warfare in northern China at the North Korean border. And my grandfather, along with Y.T. Wu, brought this story to through John Powell, who was an editor. He wrote the story about this germ warfare, and the story was then brought by my grandfather and Y.T. Wu to the Dean of Canterbury, not the Archbishop, but the Dean of Canterbury, who was a Soviet-phile, a Sinophile, he was just an interesting character that you have to read about in the book. But essentially, he finally believed the story about America committing germ warfare and brought it back to England, where it created a real controversy. One of the people who defended the Chinese leaders regarding their claims of germ warfare, and this occurred in the Parliament when they were trying to excommunicate or sanction the Dean of Canterbury, Hewlett Johnson, was the 12th Duke of Bedford, Hastings Russell. So he was outspoken in telling the other lords of the Parliament that they should listen to this story and perhaps believe the Chinese leaders. So that was 1952. During this time in America, where my mother was, McCarthyism started to rise up. And my mother was somewhat caught up in that to some degree, as many Chinese students were, because the Chinese students that were caught here, because the communists took over in 1949, the students were sort of trapped. And the Immigration Service, U.S. Immigration Naturalization Service, wanted to send the students back because they were afraid that these Chinese students would pollute the minds of Americans with communist ideas. Yet the State Department wanted to keep the students here because they were afraid that these students might be spies and bringing back secrets. So the students were sort of caught between this tug of war. Many of them were thrown in jail, lost their passports, persecuted. And my mother got caught up, as you'll see later on, with FBI interrogations. So this is my mother's record of interrogation that I got from the Freedom of Information Act, where she and many of her associates and friends, Mrs. Perot, who was member of the Hugh Blind Liquor Company, where she was her sort of benefactor, she was interrogated. Bishop Roberts, who was the Bishop of Shanghai, he was interrogated. You can see Bishop Y.Y. Tsu on the lower right, he was interrogated. So that's in the story about my mother's experience in America as a potential communist sympathizer, or what Americans, the American governments might have suspected. Here is the Chinese 1956. This is the end of the Anglican Church. So he was the last presiding bishop. After this, the church became the Three South movement, Three South Patriotic Movement Church, a government-sanctioned church. And you can see that all of the bishops are Chinese. 1947 was when the Great Leap Forward happened. That was a disaster. And then the Cultural Revolution started because Mao needed to start his revolution, to reinvigorate his revolution. He had lost power to some extent. He had given up his head of state title because of the disasters of the Great Leap Forward. And here is he trying to revive this rebellious spirit and unleash the Red Guards on the population. And my grandfather was caught up in this and persecuted, which you can read about in the book. And then 1972, this is still during the Cultural Revolution, Nixon met Mao. And this was a seminal moment, not only because of the political ramification, but for my mother and many of her friends who are now living in the United States for, how many years, 20 years, 25 years. This was a chance that they could go home because America was now on more friendly terms. It took her 3 years to get a visa. She found out that her father had died 4 years after he had actually died, because my grandmother, I think, didn't want to tell her that her father had died, because there's nothing you can do. There was very little communication during this time period. And so she had sort of kept that from my mother. And then in 1979, this is sort of where the hope comes in, that the church has been revived, and the Shanghai Religious Council revived or rehabilitated my grandfather's name. So he was persecuted, called the traitor, or a running dog, and American sympathizer, all the bad things during the Cultural Revolution. And in 1979, his reputation was restored at this memorial, and they looked at him more as a revolutionary hero. Here's my grandmother at the memorial. This is 1979. Some of the leaders and church members. So the church has been restarted. This is the cemetery of revolutionary heroes, where my grandfather's ashes were housed. So he went from persecuted during the Cultural Revolution to being named as a revolutionary hero because he was so patriotic. And that's, you'll read about why this title, Red Bishop, is more apropos of his patriotism. So I went to visit his grave, or his ashes. That was in 2002, I believe, somewhere around 2003, maybe. And I just want to follow up with my mother's 50th reunion, University of Pennsylvania Medical School. And again, I don't think you'll ever see a 50th reunion photo like this. So, and this is my father when we went to his hometown of Ningbo, and this was during a church service. The churches are full to capacity. And this is the new church that they had built in Ningbo, called the Centennial Church. So religion is alive. It's still under government control to some extent. And the last scene, this is the last chapter of the book, ends up in my mother's grave at our Trinity Church in Newton. So my grandfather preached at Holy Trinity Church in Shanghai. My mother is buried at Trinity Church in Newton. And the final scene is with my kids visiting her grave. So that's it. I hope, hopefully you get some idea of this sort of complexity of the story and all the rich history within it. And, so by following his life, you can hopefully get to know some of the seminal events and themes of 20th century China. You can almost take every chapter, every 2 chapters, and assign it to a student if you're in high school or college, and study an event or a concept, and see how some of these issues that China faced 100 years ago is still relevant and still present today in America and in different countries and in the world. So I think the story is still relevant. And I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
Thanks, Robin. That was a whirlwind trip through many centuries, but really, truly very informative about all the different facets that went into it. There are a couple comments in the chat, which I think are kind of nice to be able to point out. Okay. And then I had a couple questions, but one person said, Bonnie said, my mother-in-law was in a similar medical school class at Tufts in the late 40s and early 50s. So it's very telling, like you said, about the sort of makeup and the perseverance in a male-dominated field, which is still pretty male-dominated at this point, right, to some degree. So that's really fascinating to show that. So that was your mother's experience at UPenn, is that correct?
Yes. So she was the only woman to graduate, and so in some ways, there were women medical school graduates much before her, but at this time period, it was very rare for her to be there.
Yeah.
And so, and all through her professional life, she used to complain how she felt discriminated against. She became very sort of feminist, was very outspoken about, standing up for women's rights. Even to the point where, I belonged to this Chinese fraternity, and way back in the 70s, she would sort of rail against the men and say, why can't women join? Why do you keep women out? And then finally, about 5 or 6 years ago, this fraternity became co-ed. So she was 40 years ahead of her time.
Wow. So Karen, and this is actually great because I sort of piggybacks off of one of the questions I was going to ask, but Karen asks, why did you make it fiction? Why did it? And I feel like, well, I'll let you answer.
Well, I think the easy answer is because I'm not a biographer, and reading biographies, by Doris Goodwin Kearns, you have to have so much detail, you have to do so much research. And I didn't want to be criticized that, oh, I got this date wrong, or, this person's not, that's not his character. I wanted this story to be accessible. I didn't want it to be sitting on a shelf as sort of an academic book, which could be very dry. You can see there's a lot of history. I wanted it to be more reading like a novel, almost like a thriller. And that's why the chapters are very short. And there's sort of a little cliffhanger at the end. I want it to be very readable. But I also wanted to be true to my grandfather and my family's history, as well as the history of China. I didn't want to distort it. But so I took all these facts that I knew and molded them and shaped them and elaborated on them, wove them together to hopefully create a story that could be factual. But obviously, like when my grandfather met Zhou Enlai or met a lot of these people, there's no record of it. I knew what the purpose was and I knew what the outcome was, but I didn't really know what they said to each other. So, I couldn't really call it a work of fact, nonfiction, when I sort of embellished it to that degree. And it became very difficult when, in publicizing it, I'd be asked, what genre is it? I said, well, I don't know. It's a novelization of factual things. It's a biography. It's not a true biography. 90% of what happens in the story did happen, but, I sort of use my imagination to sort of, create, like there's this scene where my grandmother tears down these parchment papers that have condemned my grandfather in the courtyard where they lived. And I knew that she did that because my aunt wrote about it. But there's no record of actually what happened. So I created this scene that was hopefully true to what happened, but is fictionalized.
Lots of questions just came in. So thank you, everyone. This is great. So Norman had actually asked earlier in the chat as well, did Nixon help bring Christianity back to China when he opened the door? And then sort of maybe related to that too, just above that is somebody asked, is the Chinese, and I think you touched on this, is the Anglican Church active in modern China as well? And do you feel like that was sort of the turning of the tide for Nixon, or was it sometime later?
Well, Nixon still came during the Cultural Revolution. He was in 1972. Cultural Revolution didn't end really until 1976, after Zhou Enlai and Mao had passed away, and Deng Xiaoping, rose up to power. Again, this is the reason why I fictionalize, because I'm not a historian. I don't really know the answer to that question. But I think at that time, there was really no religion. They had closed all the churches. No one, people who were worshiping in their houses. There was no formal church. All the leaders, they weren't working. There was no church. There was nothing, and you couldn't say that you were Christian. I mean, you get persecuted for that. So I don't think he really, brought anything to that. I think what really happened was there was this kind of backlash to what happened during the Cultural Revolution, and Deng Xiaoping had a vision of becoming more open, more westernized, more economically free. And so that allowed the religious community to reform, to regenerate. And so that's what happened, that the churches began to reopen, but they were still all under this Three South movement governance. It was still Chinese governed. They had nothing to do with the Church of England. They weren't Anglicans. In fact, the Three South movement church was a combination. There was non-denominational. The Protestants, the Anglicans, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, they were all under one roof. There was no distinction. I don't think Nixon had any direct involvement with religion.
No, it makes sense for sure. Thank you all. There's a bunch of comments, so let's try to do, if people want to hang for maybe another 10 minutes, we'll try and get through the questions that came in. One was, actually, this is sort of relates to what we were just talking about. Grania asked, how did the Anglican Church get into China? Where they, it sounds like it's a combination of education and charity, and I feel like it had a lot to, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like you've spent more time with the subject recently than I have ever, probably. So were there any Roman Catholics there, and how did Christianity sort of enter into China originally?
Yeah, well, there were many missionaries from the Jesuits and the Catholics, the Presbyterians was, I think, the largest, and then the Methodists, and the Anglicans were actually very small. They were 10% of all the non-Catholic Christians, but they were in some ways the most educated, most organized, and so the Anglican Church leaders actually became the head of the Three South movement. They were sort of the leaders of the non-Catholic Protestant, church bodies. And so, all through I don't know when it actually began, maybe 1600s, 1700s, Marco Polo, all the sort of Western influence, missionaries began to trickle in. The first Anglican missionary was this Robert Morrison, who came in 1807. And then so because China was, open up to the Western world, there was all this influx of Western business and even law and church, different denominations, and people looked at China as sort of a breeding ground for their converts. That's the whole point. They had this huge population that they were trying to convert, but they weren't very successful. And that's where this concept of Three South, sort of a native bred, native propagated, native governed church came into being. They realized that they're not going to get any place unless they made the church very native friendly.
Yeah.
And the Catholics were, I think in 1949, there were 3 million Catholics and only 1 million Protestants. And then they went in different ways. There's actually a Catholic patriotic movement church. So the Catholics had their own church. They broke away from the Pope, and the Anglicans on the non-Catholic Protestants broke away from the Church of England and everything else, and they became the Three South patriotic movement church. So this sort of their issues were very separate, and I think only recently they started to reconcile with the Vatican in terms of the Catholics. Gotcha.
I know that Paula had raised her hand a while ago. So Paula, if you're still around, I'm gonna go ahead and ask I saw you raised your hand, if you want to unmute and ask your question. If you still had one, feel free.
She's not there. Oh, here she is.
Hi, Paula. Can you hear us?
No.
Well, I'll ask another question. Well, if we can see if we can get the audio situation figured out for Paula. So there was one question a while back. Somebody asked, and this actually, again, was something I was thinking about too. So it's good to know that we all have great ideas, great minds think alike. But Stephen asked, did writing the screenplay and the novel impact your own religious practice, and what sort of, how did going through, and I would also add, like, how did going through all the family history, how did that sort of affect your sort of background and how you reflect on religion for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I can't say I'm that religious. I mean, I think I sort of extract from my sort of Christian upbringing, sort of some principles. I don't go to church every Sunday. I used to bring my kids to to church on Sundays and Sunday school, but that became difficult. So I think I'm more of a practical person, Christian. I don't take it as a fundamental belief. I try to, take some of the good things about Christianity, and ignore to some extent the bad things. I don't think it really impacted me from a religious point of view, because I looked at the story more from a historical perspective, more from, going through what my grandfather and his family was going through. And just admired him for his dedication, devotion, not necessarily to the church, but certainly to the church, but to his country. So you'll read in the book the things he had to give up, or the sacrifices he made for his belief in the country, in China, and some of that comes from a Christian. These Christian principles of, how, and the communists, and I talk a little about the communist concepts and the Christian principles and how they can be aligned, in terms of, advocating for the poor, for the downtrodden, for the masses, so to speak, and being against elitism and rich people and all that stuff. So there is some commonality to that, except the communists, they're loyal to the Communist Party, and Christians are supposed to be loyal to God. And that was his dilemma when he was faced with this Christian manifesto. Where does his, and I talked about, where does his loyalties lie? Is he a traitor to China? Is he, is he really a Christian? Is he a red bishop, in meaning that he is sort of more a communist than he is the bishop? And so I think there was some internal angst going on during this time period, but in the end, he was very practical. He realized that, if he didn't support the government was just going to squish the church. There were at the most 1 million Protestants, and at the time there were probably 400 million Chinese. So it is not a fair fight. So he was very practical in that respect, and he eventually came to be very supportive of the church, some people of the Communist Party, because he saw the good that it did. And that's one of the perspectives I wanted to put in the book for Westerners, because especially in recent days, a lot of Americans don't know anything about China, or they have total misconceptions about China. They have an idea of China in the 1950s, and they don't understand sort of the world from a Chinese perspective. And that's what I wanted to show, the world from a Chinese perspective. And in fact, to illustrate that, one of my good friends who was one of the first people who wrote the book, and he came up to me when he was sort of 2/3 of the way through, and he said, Robin, you made a terrible mistake on page 210 or whatever. And I said, oh my God, what did I do wrong? Because I reread and re-edited this book, this manuscript 50 times. I had 3 editors, blah, blah, blah. I said, what mistake did I make? He said, Robin, you said Pearl Harbor was December 8th. It's not, it's December 7th. I went back, I said, am I wrong? Did I do something wrong? And I said, oh, you know what? It was December 8th in China, and so you have to look at it from the Chinese perspective. You're looking at it from the American perspective. And so that was very illustrative of, some of the traps we have in making, in understanding things, that we have to look at it from another person's point of view.
Yeah. Just in the interest of time, I appreciate there's a couple things that I haven't had a chance to ask, but I'm going to wrap up two questions that came in that I think are a nice sort of segue to the end. And before I do that, I'm just going to pop in the chat here. So for those who are interested, Robin does have signed copies available that you can order through his website. So the website's there. I'll also send out the recording of this when it's posted, and also a link for that to anybody who registered after the fact, just as a reminder. And then the sort of last two questions that I think kind of dovetail nicely. Annie asks, she really enjoyed reading the book. And what do your children think of the book? And sort of works with that also, as Norman asks, after showing context in Hollywood, is there any chance you think a movie would be made now that it was written? Like, how do your children feel, and what do you think are its odds of being made into a film now?
Well, the only thing they know that only my daughter has read part of the book, and she was very complimentary and said, well, this is very deep, you're very philosophical, you point out things that I never thought about, blah, blah, but she never finished the book. My son, I don't think, has even picked up the book. Some of this thing is so foreign, and I don't blame them, because it's kind of dry stuff, and they're interested in other things. Their father is not that important, and to be honest, at my age, when I was in my early 20s, I had my own things to do. A lot of I first heard about Red Bishop from my mother, probably in my teens or something. She would mention something about a grandfather and Red Bishop, and so that planted in my head. But we never discussed any of these things with my parents, either parent. And so I didn't really delve into this family story really until, I guess, maybe when my mother passed away in 2010, and I started to actually write this book. I had thought about writing the book 30 years ago and started a little bit, but we get involved in our own lives. This is not as important to kids in their own lives. So that's my kids. In terms of movies, I originally had conceptualized this grand epic movie on the big screen, with cast of thousands and all that, and major movie stars like in the old days. But now I think, even though that would be great, I think that would make a really colorful, dramatic, impactful film. I think it'll be going more towards a miniseries, because this book covers so much territory, and it's almost as if each chapter or two could be its own episode. And so I'm thinking about that. I think, who knows? I'm hopeful about it. There is this sort of push to get more Asian stories, to employ more Asian, actors and actresses, to talk about Asian stories, Asian concepts, and I think that the Hollywood industry is ripe for this type of thing. Whether or not the dollars work, I don't know, because a lot of it is driven, at least by the major studios, about what's going to make money, what is going to sell tickets. And you can make a beautiful film and all that, and no one sees it. I wrote the screenplay as if it were an Oscar-winning, Best Picture, that type of concept, because it has major themes. I think it can have colorful characters, and I think it can be impactful in how people think. So, I'm still hopeful. I'm still going to try to put it out there and see. The audience can help by reading the book, telling your friends about it, just sort of disseminating out there, and writing reviews, because, producers, they look at that. If a book is popular, they're going to want to attach something to it. But if it's not, then they may not feel it's worthwhile. So you can all help.
Yes, agreed. And it obviously, I have the copy here. I'm most of the way through it, so I found it was just nice to hear everything all together, knowing, like you said, how much of a sweeping sort of drama it is. And I personally do think that you've got good odds at a miniseries. That seems to be all the rage now. So
Yeah.
We'll keep our fingers crossed for that.
Unfortunately, Netflix lost a lot of subscribers, so I was thinking Netflix, but it's been doing, I don't know, it's been having trouble, so who knows.
Interestingly, I've heard that the Chinese market and the international market is the new frontier for Netflix. So who knows, maybe that would be the area of interest.
Well, one of the strategies I have one of my cousins had translated this book roughly, so my relatives in China could read the book. And And so I talked to him, and he said, well, it's kind of a rough translation, sort of colloquial. And I said, well, I would love to have the book translated in Chinese, because one strategy is to present the book to the censor board. And if they censor it, it could be more interesting to a Western audience if it's sort of like banned in China type of, story. So that's another way of going.
Yeah, absolutely. Nothing like a good book banning to sort of drum up interest.
Right.
Well, thank you everyone so much. I'm so glad that people hung on a little bit later than the 8 o'clock hour. Really appreciate it. Like I said, I will send out the link to everyone who had registered with your ability to get the signed copy. There are copies in the Minuteman library system if you want to borrow it from the library, obviously, as well. And then also I'll include a link to this recording when we post it on the library's YouTube channel, and lots of thanks coming in the chat. So thank you, Robin, so much for being here and sharing this fascinating story and your family history with us. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it. And if any of you have other, organizations, book clubs you want me to talk to, I'd be glad to present to anybody. The more sort of it's out there, the more happy I am.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us this evening, and look for an email with some follow-up information soon. And I hope everyone has a great rest of the evening.
Thank you, Lauren.
All right. Thanks so much. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.